2001. What Went Wrong? Bernard Lewis on Islamic Extremism in the Middle East. After that, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins' expose on what drives global economic development. And at midnight, The End of Faith, Sam Harris on the dangers of religion in modern society.
Is Social Security in crisis? Former Senator George McGovern says no in his new book, Social Security and the Golden Age. He details his plan for the program at this talk from Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C. It's 50 minutes.
Yesterday, I'm Carla Cohen. I'm one of the owners of Politics and Prose, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight, especially Senator McGovern. Yesterday, he called me and said he was worried that we might have too small a crowd because of the Redskins game. I, being the true bookaholic, said, "What Redskins game?" Anyway, it's very gratifying to see you all here tonight in a society that's characterized by the trivial and the easy. It's wonderful indeed to have such a large turnout for Senator George McGovern. To many of us, you're still a hero. And we can show our appreciation for the fights that you've engaged in on our behalf. Let me say also that you are a kind, considerate man who has never resorted to any of the cruel, distorting tactics that routinely characterize politics today, from DeLay to Cheney to that woman who tried to attack Congressman Murtha, whose name we won't bother to remember. Indeed, we have taken the occasion of the you have taken the occasion of the publication of this essay to remind us of your true positions instead of the ones attributed to you in 1972 during the campaign. And those positions are still valid. We only wish that we could go back and reverse history. This book, Social Security in the Golden Age, is part of a series called the Speaker's Corner books that's put out by a Colorado publisher called Fulcrum. We have several other in the series and will continue to have them. Senator McGovern's contribution is a very important one. It's important to correct the record once again on Social Security. The economic problems facing the United States not from any crisis facing Social Security, but for reckless government spending and the huge deficit. I'm also glad that someone of your stature says what's obvious. Any shortfalls that in the future in Social Security deposits can easily be made up by removing the cap on our earnings. One housekeeping word before we start, and that is that we have a microphone in the middle, and since our friends from C-SPAN are with us tonight, you absolutely must use the microphone. You cannot just get up in your seat and get recognized. So perhaps you'll move out of the aisle there and make it a little easier for people. I'm very, very, very happy to welcome Senator McGovern back to Politics and Prose again.
Well, thank you very much, Carla. It's always a special pleasure to be in this wonderful and historically rich bookstore with that great name, Politics and Prose, and to be introduced by Carla, who has hosted so many of these sessions over the years. Incidentally, for anybody that's interested, Washington is ahead 17-3. But I'm just delighted to see so many people out to hear me talk about a very little book in the middle of a great big game. This is the 11th book I've written, and if you're economizing on your reading time, you'll say it's the best one because it's the shortest. In any event, it deals with a subject of great interest to, I think, many people in this room, regardless of age. One thing every human being has in common with every other human being is that we're all getting older from the day we're born until we finally say goodbye to this world and move into the mystery beyond. The reason I wrote this book is that I've read a series of editorials and syndicated columns in recent years deploring what is painted as a calamity, that Americans are living longer. I think that's wonderful. I used to say, when the subject of aging would come up, well, it's not so important how long you live, it's what you do with the years that you have. I don't say that anymore. Now that I'm 83, I've figured out I have to live to be 100 because there's so many things I still want to get done. One of those, which is not directly related to the subject of this book, is an idea that I got some time ago and when I was the U.S. ambassador to the two big UN agencies in Rome that deal with food and agriculture. They deal with the problem of hunger around the globe. And I learned when I arrived in Rome late in 1997 that all the countries of the world had met there a year or so earlier and had pledged themselves to literally reduce by 1/2 the number of hungry people in the world. That's about 800 million people. About 1 out of 7 of all the people on this planet lived through their lives faced by chronic hunger. And the United Nations and some 185 countries, including about 50 heads of state, met in Rome and said by the year 2015, we're going to cut that number in half. But when I asked how much progress had been made on that, there was a certain embarrassment among the group that were briefing me, and then they said, well, actually, it's now 850 million people. We've lost ground in the first couple of years. So I cast around for some concrete idea that we could get our minds around, maybe get our arms around, and I came up with the American School Lunch Program. I discovered that there are about 300 million school-age kids around the world who get nothing to eat during the school day. They trudge off to school and walk a mile or two. If lucky, some of them may have had a makeshift breakfast of some kind, and then they attempt to learn something over the next 5 or 6 hours with nothing to eat. I'd just say, as an old teacher, I guess professors qualify as teachers, that I don't think you can educate youngsters under those conditions. About 120 million of those youngsters have dropped out of school. They don't go at all, or perhaps they never started. And most of those 120 million are girls, because of the favoritism towards us males in most societies. But once you start a good, nutritious school lunch in the middle of the day or at breakfast time when they arrive at school, that school enrollment jumps for both boys and girls. The learning curve goes up dramatically, and this is an interesting and final point I want to make about this before we get into Social Security and aging. These little girls that stay at home, illiterate, can't write their names, can't read even an elementary book, they start getting married in most developing countries at the age of about 10, 11, or 12. and they have an average of 6 children, mostly before they're 20 years of age. The ones that go to school, even if it's only for 6 years, 1 through 6, marry later in life. They have a better sense of what life is all about and what its alternatives are. And without abortions or any other kind of a procedure of that nature, they have an average of 2.9 children. So you slightly more than cut in half the birth rate among young women on the power of education alone. And that education, I suggest to you, is greatly enhanced by a good lunch every day. Nobody that I know of anywhere in the world has found a better magnet to pull youngsters into school than the promise of a good meal every day. And furthermore, it leaves more food at home for mom and dad and the other siblings. So that's one of the things I want to get done before, in the next 17 years. I've enlisted Bob Dole. I learned when I was in the Senate all those years that you can't get much done without some bipartisan cooperation. So here we have 2 former presidential nominees, both of us successful in getting nominated, not so successful after that, although I, for one, don't want to trade places with the landslide victor of that 1972 race. But I would, before I leave this earth, I hope that we'll be able to say every school child in the world is fed a good, nutritious lunch every day. And I'll tell you, it'll transform life on this planet in ways almost beyond imagination. I wrote this little book, as I said, because I read these editorials about what a calamity it is that we've increased the longevity of Americans. You know, at the opening of the 20th century, in the year 1900, the longevity rate in America was 49. Today it's about 78. I think that might well be the greatest achievement of the 20th century. It's true we killed 150 million people in war during the 20th century, the bloodiest, most barbaric century in all human history. But we did increase the longevity rate in spite of killing all these young men and many civilians in warfare. And I think this older group of citizens may well be the most valuable resource we have. I've said for many years that children are our most precious resource, and in a fundamental sense that's true because they've got their whole lives ahead of them, but they don't have the wisdom and the experience and the maturity and the interest in things of the mind and the spirit that characterizes older people. And one of the reasons I think older years have become more acceptable in this country is the Social Security program. It's probably the best single achievement of the New Deal. I didn't think that anybody was against it till recent years. But now we have the president, since his re-election, making what I'm told is close to 60 major speeches since that last campaign, telling us that Social Security is going broke and that we won't have any money to pay the benefits for younger people when they enter into their years after 65. That's a falsehood. I don't know whether the president is just confused or or what the problem is. But I think about Will Rogers' comment that it ain't what people don't know that's dangerous. It's what they know that just ain't so. And it just ain't so that Social Security is going broke. As a matter of fact, it's about the only solvent part of the government. And lots of other people are borrowing from it. How much do you think we have in the Social Security Trust Fund, which is supposed to be running out of money? Almost $2 trillion. 10 years ago, 1995, we had $483 billion in the Social Security Trust Fund. We've more than quadrupled it in the last 10 years, and it's still getting bigger. So I'd like to know where these figures come that the president is just. I notice he doesn't quote figures very much. The truth is that the Social Security Fund trustees, bipartisan group of thoughtful people, they estimate there'll be no problem until maybe 2042. The congressional budget says 2041. Well, I like to look into the future, but when that time comes, all we need to do is, if necessary, make a little bump in the Social Security withholding tax, as we did in 1983. You know that President Reagan came into office and immediately tried to cut back on Social Security. He was using some of the same arguments that President Bush is today. He was defeated in that effort 98-0 in the United States Senate. Even Jesse Helms voted against him, and from that point on, President Reagan abandoned the fight on Social Security. Now we have a president who's picked up on the same thing, says that we're running out of money. Let me just say, I was around the Congress and American politics for a long, long time. I've lived in this city for 40 years. It's, by the way, very pleasant to come back for a visit. I can guarantee you that Social Security is never going to run out of money. Never. There's not anybody here old enough to see that happen. And the reason is quite clear. First of all, it's a fiscally sound program. It's always paid its own way. In fact, it didn't even used to be included in the budget. But President Johnson thought that it had some embarrassment about the high percentage of the budget that went to the Pentagon, to the military. And so he persuaded Congress to include the Social Security program in the federal budget, even though it continues to pay its own way, and has always done that, and always will. But even the experts are telling us there won't be any problem of any kind until either 2041 or possibly 2042. Now, I've suggested in this book that there is one problem that's always bothered me about Social Security, and that's the regressive nature of the withholding tax. You know, people who earn above $90,000 don't pay anything above that 90,000 figure. They get a free ride on that portion of their income. If you just repeal that and say that no matter what you earn, you have to pay a certain percentage of it, just the same as working people. But if I don't mean that there aren't a few rich working people too. But the point is that would bring in a substantial amount of additional income if we ever need it. If we do that, we could afford actually to exempt workers from the first $20,000 of their income. And I think that would be a good thing to do. They've been paying on a regressive basis all these years. It's one of the reasons we got $2 trillion stashed away. So I suggest in this book that if we really want to reform the system, what the president ought to get behind is to exempt lower income people from paying that tax and require all of us, once we get to 90,000, to continue paying on what is above that. I think this is important not only because, as I've suggested, we have a great resource in our older people, but we need to make their lives more secure, and we don't need this alarmist talk about Social Security going broke. It's not going broke. The federal government may be going broke, but not Social Security. We used to say the size of that debt, which has ballooned under the present administration, didn't matter, but because we owe it to ourselves. You can't say that anymore. We owe it to the Chinese, the Japanese, the Germans, a number of other countries, and I worry about that part of the government that's not paying its own way. And I'd like to suggest that as quickly as possible we ought to stop this business of getting into costly wars that are none of our affair. I don't want that for 1 minute to be taken as a criticism of our soldiers and their officers who are over there in Iraq. I never once criticized our soldiers or the officers for the disastrous blunder into Vietnam, and I don't intend to criticize the military now. They take their orders from the White House, State Department, the Congress, and we'd be in an awful lot better shape as a country, and our standing in the world would be so much higher if we just avoid these bloody, needless wars. And I agree with Congressman Murtha, who I happen to know gets his information from senior people at the Defense Department, that we ought to terminate this involvement in Iraq as quickly as possible. Then we'd have to worry less about great domestic programs like Social Security, and our standing in the world would rise accordingly. Well, that's probably enough for me to talk about here, Carl, and I'll be glad to take a few questions from the floor here.
Two terse questions of an enviable war hero and statesman. One, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that poverty in the United States of America is criminal, which must entail a reasonable remedy. I invite your comment. The other question is not Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, by orders of magnitude in the context of world poverty, not demanding enough money? Thank you.
On the first question, I think poverty should pass into history. That's the goal of the United Nations at the present time. And that's one of the reasons I urgently hope and pray that we'll see an end to these needless wars. They're so enormously expensive. Vietnam cost us $600 billion. This one we're in now will probably run to $500 billion, maybe up to $600 before we get out. And that doesn't count the real cost of it, the loss of these young men. In some of the bravest young people we have. But we could make a much bigger contribution to ending poverty in our own country and assisting others abroad who are less fortunate if we could divert some of those funds that are being used for destruction into constructive projects, the creation of more food-producing ability, the development of sanitary sources of water. I was in Ethiopia the other day, and I was walking through I was walking through a little village. I guess over the last 50 years, I've walked through 10,000 dusty villages around the world. And I saw a little boy do something I've heard other observers say. There was a kind of a gutter in the road and muddy water, and he leaned over, reached down, and drank the water. You know, the chances of that boy escaping early childhood disease are almost nil. So water is important. It's going to cost some money to conserve and develop the water resources of the world. We need to do that in this country, and it needs to be done internationally. But the reason I have concentrated on child nutrition, school lunches, is that somehow foreign aid has a bad name, not with me, but with many of our fellow citizens and many of the members of Congress. This whole subject of foreign aid turns them off. But if you talk about feeding hungry kids, I'd like to see somebody who's against that. There's so many things we could do about poverty, especially in our own country, if we just had a more sensible allocation of resources. Look at health care. Here we are with 45 million Americans with no health insurance. An effort was made in the Clinton administration in the early weeks under Mrs. Clinton's direction to develop a comprehensive health care package. I think they made some errors. One was holding their meetings behind closed doors. If you want something to be widely publicized in this town, just announce you're having a meeting behind closed doors. And secondly, they had too complicated and big a package. I say that as someone who has genuine affection and admiration for the Clintons. What I would do is a much more simple approach. I think their bill was 1,350 pages long, if my memory is right. First of all, nobody's going to read that, either in Congress or in the press or anywhere else. I would just have a little one-line bill. Congress hereby extends Medicare to all Americans from birth through the age of 6 years. Then everybody knows what Medicare is. It's wonderful, I think. I've been getting it since I was 65. My kids don't get it. My grandchildren don't get it. So I'd begin with those from birth through the age of 6. 2 years later, all Americans age 7 through 18. 2 years later, 19 through 35. 2 years later, 36 through 64. And then we're all covered with Medicare. You can't mislead people on what Medicare is. They know what it is. They know it means that the government uses some of our taxes to pay for everybody's medical care, their hospital bills. You can go to the doctor of your choice. You can go to the hospital of your choice. You can get the prescriptions you need, and the government will cover the cost. Of course, it's our money as a collective group, but it's the kind of thing an intelligent, humane society should have done long ago. And those are some steps that I think we could take to lift people out of poverty. I've read the report that you talk about that was done on behalf of the United Nations by the American economist. I think it probably is going to cost more money internationally to eliminate poverty. But we're a long ways from making that kind of commitment. So I begin with food, make sure everybody has enough to eat. And I guess the second thing I'd put on the list is sanitary water, and maybe third, health care. People are not going to have good health if they don't have good nutrition and clean water. So I'd put them in that order.
Yes, George, my name is G.R. Quinn. I had a question. Your side is calling our people in Iraq Nazis and terrorists, yet in your book, you're bragging about being a bomber pilot. You drop bombs on civilians in Italy. Aren't you a war criminal?
Let me say that I believed with all my heart. I was 19 years old at the time of Pearl Harbor, and I joined as soon as I could get in the United States Army Air Corps and flew 35 combat missions against the most heavily defended targets in Europe. I'm proud of that. I respect pacifists, but I came to a conclusion that Hitler was an inhuman monster who had to be stopped. And whatever part I played in helping to smash his war machine, I'm proud of that. The 15th Air Force, to which I was attached, was hitting primarily oil refineries and tank factories, airplane factories. I want to quickly add, that's the last war I believed in. The ones since then I felt were not something that warranted the support of the American people. Apparently General Eisenhower felt that way about the Korean War. He said in 1952 when he was running against Adlai Stevenson, if I'm elected, I'm going to go to Korea and put an end to this. And he did, to the relief, I think, of 90% of the American people, which is what I wish would happen in the case of Iraq. But as I said earlier, I don't call soldiers war criminals. I don't call their officers war criminals unless you have something like the My Lai massacre, a deliberate slaughter of innocent little children, men and women. But these soldiers are doing what their government commands and doing it as well as they can, and I have never criticized American soldiers.
Thank you.
Senator McGovern, first question. Where exactly did you get the statistics for the $2 trillion?
The Congressional Research Service.
Okay.
It's a little under $2 trillion now. It's the figure on 1995 was the end of September of 95, and the same on the figure that I gave you 10 years later when it's approaching $2 trillion. It's a little less than $2 trillion, but rounded out, and that's about where we're at. It's correct to say it's 4 times as large as it was 10 years ago.
And just a general question about privatization of Social Security. Do you have just general qualms about an individual choosing to privatize their own option of Social Security?
Yes, I do. I think the strength of Social Security is that everybody who is working, who has a job, is required to participate. If you start telling people they're better off putting their money in the stock market than into the Social Security Trust Fund, that means less money for everybody in the Social Security. You really will put the program in Dutch if you have a president using the bully pulpit to urge people to quit putting money into Social Security and to start putting it into private accounts. I suppose that means the stock market or horse racing or whatever.
Well, I mean, I don't know if we can go to those type of assumptions, but I think after, September and Katrina, I think it kind of shows that we can't have all that much trust in the government. Uh-huh. I mean, what about protecting for our own future?
Let me ask you this: if you really believe that, how do you figure that since 1935, when Social Security came into being, it's never had a deficit? And what is your answer about how inefficient the government is if I tell you what is a fact, that 99 cents out of every dollar you put in the Social Security Trust Fund will come back in the form of benefits to the people who are contributing to Social Security? It's the lowest overhead in the handling of either private money or public money that I know. Do you have any idea what the bank takes out when they handle your money for you. Do you know what the credit card companies charge you for handling your money?
10, 15%?
Very high. So the great strength of Social Security, and the reason it's always been able to pay its own way, is that it's a mandatory program. If you're going to hold a job, both your employer and you pay in an equal amount every month. I think it's a very fair system, and it'll come back to you in good dividends later on. If you know, Social Security not only covers people over 65, but if a worker is disabled, he's paid. If he dies before he reaches 65, his dependents get the funds. So, in my opinion, if I could put my name on one piece of legislation above all others, I'd like to be known as the father of Social Security. I can't claim that.
Having worked on your campaign for the presidency and having put a button on the day after the election that said, impeach Nixon. This is the truth. I had this button that said, impeach Nixon. I was wondering what your assessment is, whether history will repeat itself before 2008.
You mean will we have an impeachment?
Well, I would hope so.
I don't see that happening, but how do any of us know?
Well, no one thought anything would happen with Nixon either. They all thought I was crazy when I wore this button that said impeach Nixon. The day after the election, when you were defeated.
Well, you and I had read about Watergate before the election.
Right.
A lot of people didn't pay attention to that.
That's right.
I used to tell audiences in the 72 campaign, we're dealing with the most corrupt administration in American history. The next day, somebody would stop me walking down the street or in a hotel lobby or wherever, and they say, George, I'm for you, but now I think you have gone too far. You can't call the President of the United States corrupt. But after the election, some of the same people wondered why I hadn't warned about what we were up against. I always thought the greatest error of the Nixon administration was something for which he wasn't impeached. It wasn't in the bill of indictments. And that is needlessly continuing the war in Vietnam another 4 years. 20,000 of the 58,000 soldiers we lost in Vietnam over a period of almost 30 years died in the first 4 years of the Nixon administration.
Well, thank you very much for everything you've done for the country, starting in World War II, unlike what somebody else thought, till currently. I'm with Physicians for National Health Program, and we obviously support your kind of approach of universalizing Medicare to get national health insurance. Do you see anybody up there and currently in office or out of office who are going to lead that charge, and how can we get to that point?
Well, I think there are a number of people in the Congress that will go in that direction, but I think they've come to the conclusion that it would be a failing effort with the White House and the Senate and the House in the hands of the opposition party. I'm not assuming everybody here is a Republican, but let's just look at the reality of it. I think at the present time, given the structure of the Congress, that it'd be very difficult to enact comprehensive health insurance. It's even hard with a strong advocate in the White House pushing it unless you control the House and the Senate. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to work for it, because the day will come where we've been the only industrial country on the planet without comprehensive health care for a long time, but someday we'll catch up, I hope. I've always thought, since I was a child, and I still do, that we live in the greatest country on earth. We must be great, because we make so many blunders and then recover from it that only a great country with great institutions and a constitution and a Bill of Rights would recover from those mistakes. So I continue to think we must be the greatest country. And not very many people around the world that share that view anymore, sad to relate.
What do you suggest that candidates in the next presidential election do to get the youth interested in issues of Social Security, especially since today we're convinced that it's something that will not exist when we become of age?
Well, what I do in this little book that I hope you'll all get, you can stick it on your inside pocket and read it on the bus driving to work. I propose an alliance between the so-called Y generation, which are those that are now in high school and college, or that age group. In other words, the oncoming generation, that they enter into an alliance with old people like I am, those over 65, and that together you'd have maybe the two biggest voting blocs in the country joining hands, and I would suggest their first target ought to be Social Security, since every American sooner or later benefits from that, but tied in with that, comprehensive health insurance. The last part of this book describes how an alliance like that could be formed. It's no secret that I've always had a special love affair with young people in this country. But I'm learning to love old people just as much. And those are my two favorite groups right now, the young people and my grandchildren and so on. And, pardon? You left out the children. Yeah, the children and young people. That's one group. But the reason I left the children out of this political equation is that they can't vote. That's another reason why we ought to give special consideration to their needs, because they don't have any political power. But if you could get this, what's being called the Y generation, and I'm told from teachers and professors and other people working with this oncoming generation that many of them have a streak of idealism. Some of our industries have discovered that morale among their workers goes up if they can enlist them in some volunteer project where they work for nothing for an hour or so after work, or maybe on Saturday afternoons, or come in for a few hours on Sunday. For example, this firm Costco, I get the name right, Costco, yeah. They decided to experiment with this. The head of that company is a very astute, imaginative man, and he learned, talking to his workers, and he stays pretty close to his employees, that they weren't satisfied simply with a 9-to-5 job. They wanted to do something else that would make a difference in their community. And he conceived the idea, why not build a swimming pool and a playground, a supervised playground, around their big plant in Marietta, Georgia, near Atlanta. And it was such a smashing success, and the workers were so proud of it, that they're now building 1,000 of those across the country. And he invited in 25 other corporate heads for an all-day meeting in Atlanta. Now a lot of other companies are doing this. They're doing it partly for humanitarian reasons, but also partly for self-interest, because the morale of the workers goes up. And they look forward to going to the plant because they know at least part of the day they're going to be giving away their time to something that'll make children laugh and play and have a good time. So I think we need to give more thought in trying to enlist young people in politics to the public service angle involved in it. My old colleague in the Senate, former Senator John Culver, always says that politics is the best game in town for consenting adults. And I think we got to get that idea across to people that politics is fun. Politics is a dynamic, interesting, intriguing, maddening, frustrating enterprise that'll take all you've got. And I preach that every time I get a crack at young people. It's a great profession to go into, too. I've been very fortunate in my life. I've never had a job that wasn't fun. I guess flying a bomber wasn't exactly fun, but I believed in what I was doing even then and drew certain satisfaction out of it. And I enjoyed teaching. I even considered being a clergyman like my father for 1 year, but it's probably a break both for the church and for me that I abandoned that. But I've thoroughly enjoyed all those years in politics. I wouldn't trade it for anything else. And I think it may be the noblest profession anybody can get into if they give it their best.
Senator McGovern.
This will be the last question because we got to go see how the Redskins are.
I voted for you for president, and I promised my mother that if I had the opportunity, I would tell you that she voted for you as well.
Thank you. Please give her a big hug for me.
I sure will. I see a certain analogy between the basis of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the alleged basis of weapons of mass destruction, both supporting the president's decision at that time to go into a war or to upscale a war. And I wonder, with the information that you have, realizing that you're not in the office now, what would you be doing now? What type of decisions would you make regarding Iraq?
If you mean in terms
if you were president?
Oh, well, I would explain to the Congress. I suppose you'd begin by calling in the leaders of Congress, the chairman of the committees that have the most jurisdiction, foreign relations and armed services, and tell them why I'm opposed to the war and why I think it's not in the interest of the United States to continue it any longer. And that as a way of easing our withdrawal, you could say, well, we've accomplished some things there. If Saddam Hussein's no longer on the throne, and we've arranged an election, we've helped encourage the writing of a constitution, and the time now is to come home. It's not a matter of this silly phrase, cut and run. You don't just cut and run. You can't when you're going to move 130,000 troops. It takes time to plan the staging and the withdrawal, to take into consideration their safety, and so it has to be done in an orderly fashion. I think when we cut and ran is when we cut and ran from common sense in going in there. I think that, I think that men like Congressman Murtha, he's said widely in the press to be a hawk, whatever that means, but what it has worked out in his life, he's always supported the military. He's always been very close to the Pentagon. He was a colonel in the Marines for 37 years. This silly woman that called him a coward on the House floor. I couldn't believe that. I sometimes think that these bombastic characters who like to beat on their chests and talk how brave they are, when they send young men over to war, they ought to volunteer to go with them. Some of them might not be in sufficient physical shape to carry a rifle and to fight, but at least they could go ahead of the troops and set off the mines that it's better to have old guys like me doing that than these 18 and 19-year-old boys. So I think you could go on network television as the President of the United States and give a reasonable summary of why we went into Iraq and what are the realities we've encountered and why it's in our interest now to turn matters over to the Iraqis, hopefully with some help from the United Nations. And although I don't think anybody's all that anxious to pick up the mess that's been created there. And I don't pretend for 1 minute it's going to be a joyful scene when we leave. It's not joyful now. People are killing each other, and it looks to me like that insurgency is increasing all the time. The intensity, the number of incidents, and the reason for the insurgency is that our army's in their country. We Americans used to be the insurgents when the British Empire was trying to control the 13 colonies. So the quicker we get out of there, I think the quicker the insurgency will die down. There could be some civil strife there. The Shiites and the Sunnis and the Kurds don't like each other very well, but that's been going on for hundreds of years, and it'll be going on for hundreds of years after we leave.